Thank you very much, Ambassador Rubin, for your presentation. And thank you and the members of the State Department for the diplomatic service that you all do to help keep our country safe. There's a question to you where, um, while you said that causation, I'm paraphrasing the question, the causation is not in your bailiwick. And as you're aware, embassies have members of diplomatic security that protect the building, if you will. And so they asked, what sort of things can you talk about that are being done in terms of protecting people against any possible hypothetical pulsed attacks or radio frequency attacks? And I want to add to that question, all of the attacks that have not happened inside the embassy, but have happened in hotels or apartments, which are not, don't have the same level of protection. But if you could comment on that, please.
Absolutely. And let me just add, not just hotels and apartments, but cars and offices of other people outside the embassy. And that's one of the hard parts in trying to figure this out. We have a great diplomatic security service. They're professionals. They work very hard to keep us safe, but it's very hard to address threats that you can't understand. And I would say if it were just our embassies, which tend to be fairly hardened, although not against RF or energy or other things, but there are things that could be done inside our embassies, but that's clearly not the entire problem. And as a matter of fact, with the people we've spoken to, a majority of the incidents have occurred outside our official premises in housing, hotels, cars. So that makes it even harder. Obviously, we've come a long way in terms of giving people advice and recommendations on what to do if they think they're experiencing symptoms. I think now our security officers overseas are much better briefed and ready to respond. I will say there were some very difficult moments over the past 4 years where people were essentially told, never heard of that, you must be imagining it. I think you need to talk to the psychiatrist, but she or he won't be here for 3 months because, as you know well, visits are infrequent in certain parts of the world. If you want to request a curtailment of the assignment for compassionate reasons because you're clearly experiencing mental illness, then we can do that. But we have no idea what you're talking about, and this must not be something real. I don't think anyone's saying that now, but initially there was a lot of that. There was also a lot of people being told, well, we can't send you back to the US for a medevac for evaluation, but if you want to ask to curtail your tour and end your assignment and go home and pursue it with your own doctors, because once we get back from an assignment in general, we're on our own in terms of medical care, although Med is doing better. The State Department medical office is doing better now than it was in providing assistance to people who do come back from overseas. But that can be a very damaging thing to do, to just leave an assignment without explanation. And the way our system works is it can't be explained in an evaluation, which means when you're being reviewed for promotion, all they know is that you left and you didn't complete your assignment. So for all those reasons, I think it's a big concern. I will say, I didn't hear anybody mention it, but I recently rewatched some episodes of Madam Secretary, and there is actually an episode set in my former embassy in Sofia, Bulgaria, of some kind of sonic or RF attack on the US embassy there. It was depicted as being inside the embassy building. But I thought, given that it's about 7 years old, the episode, I thought that was a little eerie.
Another question that was asked by Dr. Cullum earlier this morning in an email to me. Do we know of family members, including children overseas, diplomatic dependents, who've been impacted by this? And if you're able to comment, where have they gone for their medical care? Because my understanding is a child couldn't go to Walter Reed.
Correct. The answer is yes. I can't give you exact numbers, but just among the people who've asked us for our assistance, we know of several. We know of a family that recently came out of Germany with a 10-year-old kid, and the brain scan showed abnormalities. And I know there are a lot of people on this call who understand better than I do. That doesn't prove causation, obviously, but the kid was experiencing pretty serious symptoms of something, and then there do apparently appear to be abnormalities. That's just one case. There are others, and of course that's wrenching, and that's the kind of thing that. And yes, it's not possible for children to go to Walter Reed, and in general, people are on their own in the sense they have to track down competent care. And there aren't a lot of specialists, even in DC, who deal with this kind of thing. So that's pretty scary also.
Dr. Chris Gilbert of Psychology Today has a question. If you can describe any cases that have happened in automobiles. That's something new that hasn't been widely publicized.
Only that we have colleagues who have reported to us, not that attacks occurred solely in automobiles, but that they had experienced symptoms of an attack both at home and in their car. And I can't say any of this has been documented except by reporting, but it definitely has been reported. And that is also obviously a big concern.
Christian Hagenmuller asking, how can the international community support the forensic and medical forensics, if you will, and search for further evidence? Is that something you're able to comment on?
Well, I know there is an interagency effort working on causation, and we're not part of that. And I don't wish to be. And I imagine that they would be sharing information, especially within the Five Eyes and with other countries. We do know that Canadian diplomats have reported similar attacks, and I'm quite sure that there's been communication with their security and medical people. But that is one of the other puzzles of this is U.S. and Canadian diplomats have reported this, but to my knowledge, not diplomats from other allied countries. So it raises some interesting questions there. But I do imagine that is going on, and I imagine every embassy, every diplomatic mission overseas, certainly our allies are thinking about how do they protect their people, could this happen to them, and taking their own steps.
I think that's all the questions we have. I want to thank you, Ambassador Rubin, for your presentation. And we're going to take a break and reconvene at 2:45. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Recording stopped.
Hey, Dr. Giordano.
Hey, sir, how are you? Let me pop up my video.
Yeah, we got a few minutes.
Sure. I think that you've actually suppressed my video.
Oh, we can,
Let's see if we can bring that back up.
you can fix that.
Try it one more time.
Maybe one of my staff is
Oh,
blocked.
here we go. Here
Oh,
we go.
there we go.
That should work. Hey, there we go.
Nice to
Hello.
Thank you for being part of this. You're on at 3:30 Central Time.
Right.
Dr. Staub will be talking for about 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll bring you on.
Okay.
I don't know if you were able to hear any of the stuff this morning or the last few.
No, I was not.
What we've sort of done is take in the morning, take it from the bedside view, the clinical research view, patients with PPPD and vestibular migraine and otolaryngolic complaints and cognitive rehabilitation in the Department of PM&R, and our neuropsychologists talked about TBI, all the different patients we see at the Brain Institute with these kind of syndromes, sort of take it at the clinic level. And then we brought in Dan Hoffman and Mark Polymeropoulos and Ambassador Rubin to sort of take us to the 30,000 foot level of the US government and the White House, and how they this kind of a new condition and how it affected different aspects of our diplomatic and intelligence readiness, and the personal story of Mark Polymeropoulos. And then Dr. Staub and you will kind of bridge that with my understanding. I love your slides. We'll bridge that with the clinical stuff this morning, and sort of that'll be a nice wrap up to pull the thought streams together. We're so glad to have you here.
Well, thank you very much. So with your permission, you've seen my slides, correct?
Yeah.
Good. So with your permission, what I'll do is I'll just briefly provide them with an overview of the actual process that was involved with the abductive forensics originally with those Havana patients, and then how those conclusions were validated. Of course, I can only discuss those things that are not classified.
Right, of course.
And I'll state that. I mean, that there are certain things that, while they may seem obtuse to those in the audience, some of those details simply cannot be filled in at this time because they either remain classified or they remain confidential and classified information pending release. But these have been validated and verified. And so we also know at this point there's about 100 other individuals who in the verification validation pipeline. And then what I'll do is I'll go through that and then discuss some of the ethical issues that come upon this type of a thing and what that really portends for sort of the larger picture of engaging medicine for biosecurity and national security. Okay?
That sounds good. We'll look forward to having you. So we'll mute you now, and I'm going to mute myself, and we'll wait for Dr. Staub. Thank you.
Excellent, sir. Thank you. And thanks again for your interest in my work.
Dr. Staub, are you on okay? Dr. Staub?
Ken, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All
So,
right, I can't start my video though because the host stopped it. So if you have someone,
yeah.
there we go.
Tammy
All
will.
right, we're good.
Here we go. So we'll start in 2 minutes. Okay.
All right. And then
Oh,
I'll wait I'll go ahead and share my screen when you're ready.
yeah, I'm going to introduce you very briefly. And we'll
All
go.
right, thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Staub, can you hear me? It's Jim Giordano.
Yeah, Jim, I can, yes.
So nice to finally meet you, although it's a virtual forum.
There's lots of that going around these days.
Yeah, absolutely. So hopefully the COVID crazies haven't affected you or your family too badly.
No, doing okay. And you?
Wonderful. Oh, doing just great. Actually loving this working from home. I've actually been following your work for a while. I think we have a mutual colleague, Dan Hall-Flavin.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I've known Dan for the better part of 15 years or so. And so I actually have come to know your work with regard to some of those ongoing issues that you've dealt with. And so nice to finally meet you.
Well, good to meet you too. Good to be joining you. I think we may be together towards the end here.
Yes, sir. Looking forward to it.
All right.
Okay.
We're going to.
Recording in progress.
Okay, good. Good afternoon after a break. I'd like to welcome all our panelists back and welcome our attendees and give a special welcome to our last two speakers. First, we're going to have Dr. Jeffrey Staub, who's a professor of psychiatry and chief of psychiatry at the Mayo Clinic, who's going to talk about his research with PPPD and his clinical work involving PPPD, and also some of his work where he was a member of the 2020 National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine panel on Havana syndrome under the leadership of Dr. David Relman at Stanford. And then after that, we'll have Dr. James Giordano, a professor of neurology and biochemistry at Georgetown, and also a adjunct professor at the National War College, and who's done a lot of work with DARPA and the Institute for Defense Analysis, talk about his views of the Havana syndrome and how to tie the different threads together that you've heard about in the morning and with the clinical presentations and the most recent presentations kind of from the US government's 30,000-foot view, along with a very human and personal story from Mark Polyperopoulos of the victim impact of someone who's suffered from Havana syndrome during his work with the US government. So with that, no further ado, Dr. Staub, you're on.
Great, thank you. All right. Well, I sincerely appreciate being part of the panel today. I thank Dr. Tominga, Dr. Declava, and the UT team for hosting this, and hope that I can make a small contribution as we go forward in the next for the rest of the afternoon. So as Dr. Declava said, I did serve as one of two psychiatrists on the National Academy's panel. I'm also a member of two scientific societies, and I was the chair of the Barony Society, that's an international neurotology research society that defined persistent postural perceptual dizziness. I'm not going to talk about grant fund things directly related to my grant funding or commercial interest, but I am, for the clinicians in the audience, will mention some off-label uses of two classes of antidepressants that we can sometimes gain benefit for patients with PPPD. So we'll talk a little bit about relationships among structural, functional, and psychiatric illnesses. Just a brief overview. You've heard some of this, but I want to put it in context. And I'm just going to point out a couple of specific things from the National Academy report, and then we'll delve into PPPD specifically, and as it's related to U.S. government employees from the Havana mission, which were the ones that we that we looked at from the national academies, with a few from China. So this was my introduction to syndromes like what we're trying to figure out with the Havana syndrome. I was a naval medical officer, finished my training at what was then Bethesda Naval Hospital, now Walter Reed, and on active duty during Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And we saw at that time some of the first sailors and Marines who returned with what we now call Gulf War syndrome. And this was a chief petty officer, a bulldozer driver in the Navy Seabees, who said, "Doc, why am I a head case just because you can't figure out what's wrong with me?" And what he was saying was something that is a legacy of 20th century medicine that has crept into this problem. And I want to put it in this context. There is one and only one time in which B equals not A, and that is when we know all of A, all of B, there's a firm line between them, and there's no overlap. But in this area, as in lots of areas of medicine, there is the unknown, and the A's and the B's don't have firm lines and boundaries, and they overlap. So under that circumstance, it's impossible to find anything solely by what it's not. And there are no diagnoses of exclusion, even though we use that term in medicine a lot. It's logically impossible unless we know everything. So this is the trap that that we've heard both patients and a lot of doctors, press, and others that have fallen into this when it comes to trying to think about the Havana syndrome. So what's an alternative? And this is beginning to move forward. You heard some discussion about this from our UT colleagues this morning. So rather than taking this approach of ruling out stuff, ruling out all the structural things, and then coming to the default conclusion there must be psychological factors, the approach now that is changing but not yet changed in medicine is to rule in. And that by that we mean look for the structural, metabolic, and cellular illnesses that may be present. Look for psychiatric disorders and psychological factors. Look for changes in functioning and functional disorders. The important thing here is that if I identify something in the structural, cellular, or metabolic range, it only tells me that. It tells me nothing about the presence or absence of other of the psychiatric or the functional problems, which each have to be evaluated in their own right. So a shift to this multidisciplinary approach where each specialist contributes to the evaluation of the presence or absence of signs and symptoms and test findings in his or her area of specialty, building in a layered way the overall picture of which patients have, both from a clinical standpoint, but really importantly from a research standpoint. So what do we mean by functional? It turns out it's been around in medicine for a couple of hundred years. And so here's a quote from a Scottish physician from 200 years ago, and saying that function simply means a change in the mode of action of an organ, unconnected to any perceptual structural alteration. So this idea that functional is somehow, a synonym for psychiatric, psychogenic, that's all 20th century stuff. It originally just meant change in functioning, hence the term functional. And when we defined 3PD now a few years ago, we specifically said that we were going back to that original origin and dissecting out this blend between psychogenic, psychosomatic, and functional that had really settled into the 20th century. Now back to what I just showed on the last slide. So a couple of things that I want to point out about conclusions from the National Academy Standing Committee, specifically now related today to triple PD, and that is it's really focused here on the more persistent symptoms. So you've heard a lot about those acute symptoms, but when it comes to 3PD, it's really focused on what is persisting in terms of trying to explain a portion of the symptoms that have continued to plague affected individuals. The other thing that I want to say is that as we went through various test results and so forth, the initial tests from Miami, from Penn, that our Canadian colleagues did on their diplomats, were focused on selected tests that were clinically relevant, and also the researchers involved pushing into using novel methods of discovery. And one of the challenges there is if you're researching a novel entity or an unknown entity with novel methods and you find something, the scientific obligation is to sort out whether what you found is related to the new method or the new problem that you're trying to address. And that is harder to do than it sounds. And so you have to have some both skepticism and humility about reaching conclusions too quickly. So the patients who were examined at the NIH Center, a quarter of them received the diagnosis of 3PD, and there was one other person who shared that person's medical records with the panel, who had consulted a separate tertiary neurology center and also received the diagnosis of PPPD. So that was not a diagnosis that we on the standing committee rendered. We did not render any diagnosis, but we were aware that these two specialty areas had diagnosed one patient in this case, and a quarter of the ones that were seen in that initial cohort at NIH with this functional neurologic or neurologic symptom. I also wanted to draw attention to one other aspect about the standing committee's conclusions. A lot of attention was paid to the radio frequency energy aspect of the report, but but I've not seen a lot of people focus on this specific thing, and that is that there is many people have focused on did whatever this may have been damage the brain structurally or damage the inner ear structurally. And it's really important to recognize that it's not necessary that a structural injury occurred, only that the brain or the inner ear was stimulated. And so it is possible, theoretically possible, that whatever source could have been involved, again, with those small number of cases, like what the CIA interim report recently said, what we said from the National Academy, that a stimulation could have occurred, leaving no tracks of brain injury behind. Now, that doesn't mean there wasn't any, but it is possible that the brain could be stimulated and leave no tracks, but yet cause the kind of disruption that we've seen. And the second thing that we said is that psychological and social factors can be involved potentially in some of the early symptoms, particularly those that are a little less distinct, and that we have to consider those as contributors to the chronic outcomes of patients. And importantly, from the idea of ruling in, not to the exclusion of structural, metabolic, or other factors, but as part of the overall picture. Okay, I'm going to take one diversion from 3PD just to comment on this aspect. So, were or are U.S. and government employees and their families particularly at risk from a psychological standpoint? And I think the answer to that is that nobody is invulnerable. And this quote here is an engineer. I was an engineer before going to medical school. And one of the things that we were taught was no matter how perfectly we design something, the very fact that we were designing something meant we were designing in its vulnerabilities. And that applies to human beings too. So our very dedicated, very heroic people who served and continue to serve us, by the fact that they're human beings, do have some vulnerabilities built in. That doesn't make them more or less vulnerable than others, but we can't ignore the fact that that those things are there. I also want to make sure that people understand this issue of the mass psychogenic illness. Since the 1960s, there have been very specific methods for identifying the presence of mass psychogenic illness. That is not so very different to how we identify other contagions. So you evaluate the index case, you perform the contact tracing, you find how the psychological factors spread, and rule in the presence of that. And given that there are no data that have been made public about that, it is only speculation that allows people to suggest that mass psychogenic illness was part of this. And frankly, the overall pattern, index case to contact tracing, there are some real some difficulties in even foreseeing that could occur. But it really is important, if somebody's going to raise that question, that they do it with data, because there are strategies and methods that are well established for putting forth that hypothesis. All right. Switching over then to PPPD. So it's a new term, but it's not new at all. It has been there similar syndromes were described as 150 years ago. There was a debate back then about how much visual anxiety or some blended aspects of this disorder of dizziness and unsteadiness occurred. Then we got into the 20th century where we had this dichotomous hierarchy. You were either thought to have psychogenic dizziness if nobody could figure something out structurally, or everything was attributed to an inner ear or brain problem if there was any inner ear or brain problem found. So again, the dichotomous thinking. Then towards the latter half of last century, people started to describe a variety of different syndromes that were reminiscent of those 19th century entities. And at the and 10 years ago, the Barney Society put together an expert panel, and it completed its work in 2017 to define 3PD. And here is its definition as part of the International Classification of Vestibular Disorders. There is a briefer definition that will be included in ICD-11. This is a chronic condition, so 3 or more months of unsteadiness, dizziness, non-spinning, vertigo. Symptoms don't have to be present for every single moment of every day, but rather occur in long periods. Often patients will have a brief respite of symptoms when they first awaken in the morning, and then within 30 to 45 minutes of getting up and around, the symptoms start to settle in. Once the symptoms are present, they don't have to be provoked in any way. They seem to wax and wane, but when people are upright and moving around, either actively or passively, like in a car, and especially when they're exposed to moving or visually complex visual patterns, the symptoms can increase. And I apologize, the announcement in the background here at Mayo Clinic for everybody to wear their mask is going on. That'll finish in just a second. So the other important thing is that 3PD is a condition that's triggered by a variety of different kind of events that can cause acute or episodic vestibular symptoms. So you can have vertiginous, ENT, medical, psychological distress, other factors that can cause someone to feel unsteady or dizzy, and under the right conditions, go on to precipitate 3PD. Now, since that definition was published in 2017, there have been a number of epidemiologic studies done around the world showing that it is actually fairly common. So it's not a rare thing. And you can see that in referral neurology clinics, so university or hospital-based neurology clinics, among patients with dizziness, 1 out of 5 has 3PD as a diagnosis. If you get to subspecialty dizziness clinics, like the one run by our colleagues in Ottawa or ours here at Mayo Clinic, it approaches 50% of patients. Again, that's a selected group. Even in general internal medicine clinics, however, among dizzy patients, it's about 1 out of 6 or 1 out of 7 patients with persistent dizziness who have 3PD. Now, this is what I was mentioning before. So the finding of 3PD in a portion of individuals with the Havana syndrome, unfortunately, does not tell us anything about the potential triggers, because the potential triggers can span vestibular, either peripheral vestibular syndrome, so inner ear or brain problems, anxiety or stress related situations that produce an unsteady, lightheaded, fuzzy-headed kind of feeling can trigger it. Migraine, traumatic brain injury, autonomic problems, and other metabolic disorders, blood sugar derangements, those kinds of things can all be triggers. So the finding in patients who are now months into or years into Havana syndrome that they may have 3PD as a potential explanation for some symptoms does not allow us to back up and say specifically what was the initial trigger. We do have some research that's been done over the years to look at how do we get from an acute event to chronic dizziness. And this is a study from an acute inner ear infection that causes sudden onset of vertigo, sometimes with hearing loss, sometimes not. And the patients were followed over a year, looking at the nature of their chronic dizziness. 2/3 of them recovered, 1/3 did not. But importantly, among those who didn't recover, the majority of them showed good healing of any inner ear injury that they may have had. So they compensated, or their brain adjusted, their inner ear healed for the initial deficits that was caused by the infection. So then the question is, well, why then did this group stay dizzy? And one of the predictors, and you heard this earlier from Dr. Cullum, and looking at one predictor of persistent post-concussive syndrome, is that acute anxiety in the context of the initial, excuse me, pardon me, in the context of the initial set of symptoms can be a trigger for ongoing illness. And as Mark Plimeropoulos described earlier today, acute and unexpected vertigo is a very terrifying entity. There was an emergency room study done a few years ago in which patients were asked, what was your emotional state with the onset of whatever symptoms you presented with? And it was not acute chest pain. It was not acute shortness of breath. It was not an acute car accident, but rather acute onset of unexpected vertigo that was the most terrifying symptom that patients reported to emergency rooms with. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of the physiologic and psychological research that's been done by our team and others around the world in trying to sort out what is happening in patients who have this persistent condition. So one of the ways that we can do this is by using this kind of complicated posture platform. And what you can see is that there's a person standing with and we can project a variety of different images, static and moving images into that concave screen. And also the platform on which the patient stands moves. So sometimes the platform is fixed and sometimes it sways with them. And what you can see is as we start to change the cues, so the visual cues and the cues of the pressure of the feet on the floor, we can cause people to have a bit of a decline in their stability. So here is normal individuals in blue, and so the test is challenging as it moves forward, and you have both motion of the visual field here in condition number 6 and motion of the floor. But patients with 3PD start to show that deterioration much earlier and to a larger and to a quicker extent with less provocation than normal individuals, and importantly, even less provocation than patients who have recovered from an inner ear injury. This also is a very interesting research study that was published a couple of years ago from a group in Chile. This is let me explain this a little bit to you. So this is now done virtually on the screen. When it's done with rodents in the laboratory, it's actually done in a tank of water. But virtually on the screen, this is a tank of water virtually presented. And then there's this platform that rises above the water that can be visible. And you have some practice trials here. So where the person is placed here and said, move yourself over to that platform. So they get 4 times in which they can do that. Then the platform is dropped away below the water line, so it's not visible. And the subjects are said, start here at the end and move over to where that platform was. And these, you can see there's pictures along the side walls of the video screen that are orienting cues. And the last task is that the person is placed anywhere in the tank and said, get over to that platform. So what you can see is here's the control group, and they, without any difficulty in the B and C test ones, move from the starting point either there or anywhere else, clearly to where the platform is located. No trouble, they get right there. This is a group of patients who have an inner ear injury, so a chronic inner ear injury. They have a little bit more trouble. You can see in the white, they wander about just a bit, but still end up quite well in the area of the fixed platform. These are patients with 3PD, and you can see they're pretty much wandering aimlessly. Now, remember, patients with 3PD here do not have ongoing structural injury to their vestibular system, but the development of these functional shifts that occur with 3PD make them have great difficulty with spatial orientation. So this is as an example in which functional shifts in brain activity and connectivity can really degrade performance on a relatively simple task. So I put this up here because to drive home the point that we don't absolutely need to have an established sort of smoking gun of brain injury from a structural standpoint to see that patients can suffer greatly in terms of their daily activities and abilities to perform tasks that we take for granted. Here may be some of the reasons for that. This was a study that I did with colleagues in Korea, in which we looked at, this is a functional MRI, so it is not showing structural injury, but connections. How is one part of the brain connected to another? And what you can see here is that this area of the left hippocampus has markedly decreased interactions with multiple other areas of the brain that are involved in the process of spatial orientation. This area of the brain also is involved in working memory, or that sort of short-term memory that we use to do tasks. And so patients with 3PD versus healthy controls show a reduction in connectivity of this really important area that allows us to sort of go about our day-to-day business, know where we are and what we're doing when we get there. Here's another example of functional imaging studies, and I want to take a few moments to take you through this because it drives home this point of overlap of structural, functional, psychological processes. So these are patients with 3PD. They were placed in the research scanner and put through a virtual reality roller coaster ride. So while they were in the scanner, on a screen, they watched a virtual reality roller coaster ride. So you've got an external stimulus, so an environmental motion stimulus. You have a group of patients who develop 3PD because of a structural injury to their inner ear, in this case, an infection. And what we found was that the vestibular region of the brain was reduced in activity. The visual region of the brain was increased in activity. That's called visual dependence. So shift from relying on your inner ear gyroscope to relying more on visual cues. The intensity of that shift in the visual cortex was directly related to the severity of symptoms that the patient had, and the connectivity of these visual regions with areas in the front of the brain that regulate eye movements and regulate emotional responses to stimuli was modulated by how much neuroticism, which is sort of a worrywart nature. This is not an illness. This is how worrywart or relaxed somebody is, but that personality trait modulated this connectivity differently in patients with 3PD versus healthy controls. So let me go through that once more. Again, we have patients who had a structural problem that triggered a functional illness, and when we exposed them to an environmental stimulus, the activity of their brain was in proportion to the symptoms that they were experiencing, changes in activity in proportion to the symptoms that they were experiencing, all modulated by a natural personality trait. The importance of this is that engineers have done a great job in giving us really powerful tools for sorting out what the brain is doing in terms of its structure and function. But if we do not associate, if we don't measure and correlate structural, functional, and psychological variables, we will make no sense out of the images that high technology produces. So our obligation as researchers is to make sure that we take this multidisciplinary approach to understanding a problem like 3PD in this case, or Havana syndrome, when we begin to collect data on individuals that are suffering from it. Okay, back to more the sort of the clinical standpoint. So we use this information to describe the following kind of scenario to patients. You had a precipitant. It may have been an inner ear problem. It may have been another medical event. It may have been a very stressful or anxiety-provoking situation. You shifted strategies because if your inner ear is not working, you have to rely on your vision a little bit more. If you find yourself off balance, you're going to use a little bit more of a high-risk postural control strategy, like if you would if you were walking on ice or at the edge of a cliffside. And you'll become more vigilant about your environment because it does not feel as safe. And then after time, most people will have a recovery, inner ear recovery, medical recovery, behavioral recovery, but under certain circumstances. And one of those circumstances is acute anxiety. Again, not freaking out, but becoming more vigilant about your body and your surroundings. You can settle into a persistent pattern in which you don't shift back from that high-risk postural control strategy, kind of stay stuck there. And then you're in a vicious circle of when you're exposed to some of these provoking factors, like your own motion or complex environments, that your brain is processing that information differently, driving your postural control strategies differently, and that feeds off of one another and stays in this perpetual loop. Now, not all patients, but many patients with 3PD will develop anxiety or depressive disorders. And I showed you earlier how there can be dysfunction in spatial orientation and what's called cognitive flexibility. Okay, so how do we treat this? Well, patient education, you've heard a little bit earlier about vestibular therapy. I'll talk some about medications and the role of psychotherapy and then finish in time for questions. Okay, So the role of physical therapy, first and foremost, is to normalize stance and gait, to allow people to be able to move without thinking about it. As one of my colleagues from Luxembourg says, the only time we think about our balance is when it's goofed up. Otherwise, it's an automatic process that we give no second thoughts to. And so our first goal is to get people to be able to walk and move about in that kind of a way, distribute their weight normally on their feet, and then improve the tolerance, as you heard earlier, improve tolerance for one's own motion and for the movement of visual stimuli. This happens to be the most difficult task. Those visual cues and sensitivity to visual cues seems to be one of the more difficult things to rehabilitate with people with 3PD. We do have both retrospective and prospective studies that show that vestibular rehabilitation that's individualized for patients is beneficial for at least half of patients, moving them from impairing levels of symptoms to sort of nagging in the background levels of symptoms. All right, medications. This was accidentally discovered by our group when I was then at the University of Pennsylvania, and also simultaneously by a group of colleagues in Japan. And what we were basically saying to people is, we don't know why you have chronic dizziness, but we do know that you've got this anxiety and depression that's running along with it. Why don't we treat that? Here, take this antidepressant. And people came back and said, I'm not dizzy anymore. And we said, well, we didn't really expect that, but okay. And we saw it again and again, so we began to study it. And it turns out that the group of medicines that are called SSRI, so in this case, sertraline, also known as Zoloft, or medicines like Effexor or venlafaxine or duloxetine, also Cymbalta, that those two groups of medicines seem to be able to cut the symptoms of 3PD in half. So this was our original study here from 2004. This is a larger study that was reported a few years ago from a group in China, showing that an adequate trial of at least eight weeks or more of these medications could cut symptoms in half. And what this difference is adding some psychotherapy around body vigilance, around catastrophic thinking, and I'm never going to get better, it's always going to be this way, that kind of catastrophic thinking, that adding those psychotherapy improved on top of the medication response. And there are no large controlled trials that have yet been done, but of the reported studies from around the world involving now more than 300 patients in some sort of an organized clinical trial, we've been able to show that these groups of medicines can improve symptoms. And very importantly, that improvement is not mediated specifically by improvements in anxiety and depression. Anxiety and depression do improve. If they're present, they do improve. But in a number of our studies, we had patients who I could not diagnose with any anxiety or depressive disorders who also responded well to these medications. So it is not purely psychosomatic manifestation of anxiety or depression that we're talking about here, nor does the treatment response require a mediation through psychological factors. Okay, psychotherapy is also an important part of this. It has a specific target, and that is to reduce that body vigilance, to reduce associated fear or anxiety, and kind of to reframe the kind of cognitive symptoms. I think Mark Polymeropoulos talked so much about what the team at Walter Reed was able to do, sort of restore hope and reduce some of this sense of being stuck forever in a catastrophic outcome. So our psychotherapy colleagues can have a very important role to play in the overall treatment strategy of this disorder. Now, there's some limitations of 3PD, and they apply not only to Havana syndrome, but to others, and that's depicted here. 3PD has symptoms that overlap with other problems, overlap with other chronic vestibular disorders, overlap, as you've heard, with TBI, with chronic migraine, with autonomic dysfunction, other chronic neurological disorders, other medical conditions like chronic heart failure, and primary and secondary psychiatric disorders. So no individual symptom of 3PD is unique for 3PD. The syndrome is relatively unique, but does overlap with other things. And it's also the case that amongst that first cohort that was evaluated at NIH, only a quarter of patients had symptoms that fit with 3PD. So when it comes to Havana syndrome, we have a syndrome that's been defined that has growing evidence about what its physiology, psychology, and brain responses are like, but it only applies to a portion of patients and may only explain a portion of their symptoms. So it is not sort of a be-all and end-all of the answer for Havana syndrome, but when it is present, provides a couple of three specific treatment strategies that can be incorporated into an overall treatment plan. So in conclusion, then, Havana syndrome is very much a 21st century malady. We've seen similar kinds of processes before. People have pointed out some of those, like Gulf War syndrome, but it does absolutely require a 21st century approach to diagnosis. This rule in, find the evidence for structural cerebolic or cellular metabolic illnesses, find out whether there are psychological factors or psychiatric disorders present, and then carefully evaluate, measure, and treat the functional shifts in sensory processing, sense of space, postural control that exists in patients who suffer from this problem. When it comes to Havana syndrome, 3PD is it can be part of the approach to evaluating this and is important for people who meet the diagnostic criteria, but we should not try and stuff all of their symptoms under the rubric of 3PD. And more broadly, psychological and social factors are contributors to chronic morbidity, both in patients with 3PD and, as you've heard, in patients with Havana syndrome, and that a comprehensive rehabilitation strategy that accounts for any of these factors that are ruled in is necessary to promote maximal recovery. Here's a few selected references that can be helpful for people, including the diagnostic criteria, some of the epidemiologic studies, a review of neuroimaging findings, and then a couple of things with regard to treatment. And I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Staub, for a fascinating presentation. We have several questions to already address to you. First, Dr. Dave Charney asks about other models for consideration of Havana syndrome, such as carbon monoxide poisoning and other types of brain injury. And one of the things that Dr. Charney asks is, because we know hyperbaric oxygen therapy is useful in brain conditions such as carbon monoxide poisoning and neurological decompression illness, has hyperbaric oxygen been considered as a treatment for PPPD?
So for PPPD, no, because we don't have evidence that the mechanisms that sustain 3PD are related to structural injuries that might be rehabilitated with hyperbaric oxygen. I would to answer the question about carbon monoxide directly, or other poisonings with directly related to Havana syndrome, there is a section in the National Academy's report that talks about toxicology and the possibility that these symptoms may be related to that. And really, the pattern of illness and the pattern in which it developed just didn't support that. So again, there were toxicologists and epidemiologists who were with us on the panel who were able to lead us through the evaluation of that. The Cubans at the time were spraying heavily for mosquitoes because there was the Zika virus infestation then at the time, and that's one of the ideas that people put through, that some of those organophosphates may have been part of this, but the data on the ground and the overall development of the illness just didn't support that.
Two other questions. One from Dr. Lakritz, thanking you for your talk. Have you found a therapeutic window in which it's important to initiate treatment for triple PD in order to achieve an optimal outcome?
Yeah, Dr. Lakritz, thank you for that question. So there is a hint, not so much an optimal window, but in reports of studies, so that we reported on medications that we looked at when we looked at some of the rehabilitation therapies, and that psychologists have reported, the earlier the intervention, the better. So it is not that patients will have no benefit if we catch them late, but it seems like the extent of the benefit is not as great as if we catch them early. And that applies to all three primary treatments for the disorder.
Another question is, could you comment on, since you talked about some of your MRI findings, comment on the 2019 VERMA study and your opinion on that?
Yeah, and that's something that we looked at extensively within the panel, the National Academy's panel. We had both radiation physiologists and neuroradiology experts with us. And what I would say, based on their input and also my work with teams that have looked at this, is I would go back to that comment that I made earlier about using an experimental protocol for an enigmatic illness, and that you have to take into account that you're using a technique that is not well established and not well normed. So if you find a difference, you don't know right up front whether that difference is related to the technique that you're using and therefore have found something because you have a new technique, or whether it's related to a difference in that's due to the illness. And as we heard earlier in the morning, in order to validate the methods, you have to have multiple comparison groups. So an entirely normal comparison group, a group with known illnesses. And only after you do that can you really say with a surety what it is that that you're seeing on the scanner. So the challenge in the interpretation from the Penn group was that because they saw things that they hadn't seen before, that they interpreted that as evidence of brain injury. And while that is a possibility, because they were using techniques that were really sort of at the edge of MRI scanning capabilities, you really can't say that with a surety.
Okay, there's another question from Dr. Barshikar. What is your best recommendation in terms of treatment-resistant triple PD cases? What approach does your team take in those cases?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. What we do with patients who have not responded adequately to these interventions, and that would be about 20% of the people that we see by the time they get here to Mayo Clinic. About 1 in 5 maybe don't respond to the level that we would want. We then use our multidisciplinary rehabilitation approach. So our pain rehabilitation colleagues and their rehabilitation is not just pain, but groups of patients who have chronic and persistent physical symptoms. So, like what your team is there at UT, Ken, with some of the long COVID patients with fibromyalgia, patients with postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, those kind of things. We take that multidisciplinary rehabilitation approach. And we have a 3-week intensive program that we have them go through.
I have another question that's come up that we've discussed here with our multidisciplinary team. Have you seen any benefit to using augmented reality or virtual reality devices to help in the rehabilitation of patients with more severe triple PD? I'm thinking of like Oculus Rift and things like that.
Sure. The group that actually did some of the earliest research on that is in London, and they showed that using virtual reality could be a worthwhile augmentation strategy for traditional rehabilitation techniques. I would have one caveat to that, and that is that when you place somebody in Ocular Rift or any other, even very good virtual reality environment, it is not entirely normal. And so you set up a bit of a conflict between visual motion stimuli, the seat of their pants saying that they're not moving, and depending on how they're moving their head, whether or not they're getting normal vestibular stimulus. And so some patients with 3PD find that sensory conflict to be troublesome. And so if for people who don't like that, we really emphasize rehabilitation with natural stimuli.
There's another question, Dr. Staub, with respect to Vanna syndrome patients who experience dizziness. How do you and your team differentiate between episodes that are related to directed energy and episodes that may not necessarily be related to directed energy?
Well, frankly, there isn't really a way to do that. The only thing that I would say is that if we look at the core group of people who seem to be first and most dramatically affected in Havana, those are the ones that we studied. The kind of, and people have said this before, that group of auditory and vestibular symptoms is unusual. We don't see that in neurologic illness that there's natural vestibular illness. And it's actually not something I've encountered even in patients with delusions and other primary psychiatric disorders, that specific combination of symptoms. So that's really the one where we would say perhaps we contribute that to the inciting events that are still unknown. But if I was to see a patient with Vanna syndrome that told me, in addition to the chronic day in and day out symptoms, I have these episodes, I would look to migraine, I would look to other comorbidities that can develop in patients with 3PD rather than suspect that they were necessarily continuing to be exposed to an external force.
We have time for one more question from Dr. Chris Gilbert from Psychology Today. Dr. Gilbert asks, she asks, what practical immediate advice would you give to somebody experiencing what could be Havana syndrome? Get out of the room, go back in to see if the symptoms change head position and orientation to see if there's a change, get aluminum foil around the head. What else?
You know, I'm not so sure that I would be the best person to say, well, what are you doing when something bad is happening? You know, or that I would be willing to say, you know, please do this when something bad is happening to you. I think that the best thing, given what we know, what we don't know about this, would be to try and eliminate the stimulus and then seek help. Something that these days now our diplomatic corps and others assigned overseas have been encouraged to do more. I'm not so sure that any exposure to a potentially dangerous that I would ask anybody to approach any exposure and kind of keep investigating it on their own. So I think trying to eliminate the stimulus, to remove yourself from the stimulus and to seek help would be the most prudent thing to do.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Staub, for a very wonderful and informative presentation. And now we'll shift to our last presentation with Dr. James Giordano, who's going to talk about neuroscience and ethical issues in Havana syndrome.
Thank you very much. And hopefully you can all see my slides, yes?
Yes, we can see them.
Wonderful. And you can also see me on camera, correct?
Yes, and we can hear you too.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. So I want to thank very much you for inviting me here. Certainly thanks Dr. de Kleve for the invitation, but also a real thanks to Dr. Staub's work for a number of different reasons. It becomes very important to understand that the phenomenon that we're dealing with, what is known as Havana syndrome, and I have a bit of a problem with that title because I think in some ways it can be derogatory, represents some form of dysfunction of the central nervous system that may have been precipitated by an external event. At this point, as Dr. Staub well noted, it becomes very important to identify what is going on within the central nervous system and what are the constellation of objective signs and subjective symptoms in a rule in rather than just rule out approach. So what I'd like to do for the time that I have at the end of this conference is reframe this in such a way that's somewhat more summative. In other words, to bring the presentations that you've heard to date into clear light and to certainly highlight a lot of what Dr. Staub has told you about the possibility for multiple forms of neuro and vestibular pathologies to be present, which still begs the question, well, why? What's happening here? And again, what becomes very important for us to understand is that those initial cases in Havana are prototypic cases. Those are cases that have gone through what is now being referred to as the verification and validation pipeline. And as Dr. Staub had noted, those cases were very, very unusual in that they do not represent what appears to be signs and symptoms that would be indicative of other forms of neurologic, physiologic, or even psychiatric and or psychologic conditions or disorders. Something happened there. These were, as you know, referred to as the immaculate concussion, which is not necessarily an accurate nomenclature, but certainly would suggest that there was some form of insult or injury to the head, not necessarily to the brain, but to the head. Our group has been repeatedly referring to this as embassy encephalopathy, which is sort of a fancy way of saying that there's something going wrong in the brain, but we don't know exactly what that is. We don't know if that's the primary source of these symptoms and signs, or if that's downrange, downstream. So a bit of background on this, I think, becomes important. But first of all, it's also very, very important to have a couple of disclaimers. As you all may know, a lot of the work I do continues to be sponsored by a variety of United States government agencies, Department of Defense, Department of Homeland Security, and much of the work that was dedicated to the work on Havana syndrome that I'll present to you here today grew out of my initial involvement with the case in 2016 and 2017, being called in to do abductive forensic neuroscience for the Department of State, and then subsequently working as Donovan Fellow at United States Special Operations Command. Again, none of the views that I'm presenting here necessarily reflect those of the United States government in any one of its entities, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which has also become exceedingly interested in the viability of these types of things to occur and what might produce them. So let's kind of bring these things back into stark relief. It's also very, very important to distinguish what symptoms are from what signs are. And if we're talking about ruling in and ruling out, which is very, very important, that triad, or better still, that triune that Dr. Staub illustrated in terms of psychiatric and psychological conditions and states and traits, but not necessarily disorders, underlying changes in the neurochemistry from the level of the cell to the synapse to the entire system, and then some expression in the neurological realm with regard to cognition, emotion, and behavior represent what we refer to as a constellation. I mean, think of a constellation of stars. One single star does not make the constellation, but if we put them together and we play connect the dots in a particular way, well, then that's constellatory. The same thing occurs here. And this really is the idea of what's probably going on in many, if not all of these cases. The question here, literally the begged question, is how do we play connect the dots? And are the dots the same? In other words, if we connect the dots in one way, we may get one thing. And if we connect the dots in another way, we may get something else. What's really important to do is to connect those dots in such a way as to link correlation towards some possible causality. Correlation does not imply causality. And I think this is sort of the underlying problem with much of brain science, if you will. At the end of the day, we really don't know how it is that brain produces that great stuff of cognition, emotion, and behavior. We know the gray stuff in your head is responsible, at least in part, but we don't know. The other issue is that very, very small changes in brain function can lead to serious disruptions in thought, emotion, and behavior that then feed back onto the perception of what that physiological state feels like, and as a consequence, then prompt an emotional state, anxiety, vigilance, hyperemotionality. These are important variables to fold into the quasi-calculus of approaching this type of anomalous health incident, and then parsing those signs and symptoms appropriately. Well, if we look again solely to the individuals who were affected in Havana, and if we use that lens as illustrative to then peer at those individuals who may then be or enter into the subsequent verification and validation pipeline, we can see that the symptoms, again, those subjective feelings, first-person feelings, include pressure in the head, a sense of disorientation, inability to cognitively focus, loss of vigilance, fatigue, vertigo, a feeling of tumbling, and motoric difficulties. Now, some of these may be related to others. So, for example, vertigo and motoric difficulties are certainly related by virtue of both correlation and cause. But we also must understand that what's very important to those initial cases in Havana, and will be equally important going forward, those cases that are in the verification validation pipeline, is the objective clinical signs that cannot be faked, that are representative of some underlying change in the physiology that appears to be structurally or functionally abnormal. As Dr. Staub mentioned, and as others have mentioned throughout the course of the day, these include neurological abnormalities that are tested by virtue of neurovestibular testing in terms of dysfunctions of the connectivity between the small organs of the inner ear, the connectivities of the inner ear with the brain stem, another part of the brain called the cerebellum, and those ascending pathways that process motor input, feeling, sensation, perception, orientation, and then makes meaning of these things in terms of what they represent to the individual, norm or abnorm, comfort or discomfort. And obviously, our position in space and our capability to function when something is going wrong in our physiology can also become aberrant. Now, let me pause here for a moment because there are a number of key terms that I think really must be brought to the fore. And I wholly agree with Dr. Staub's position that, in fact, if you're considering the idea of a functional neurological disorder, this is what is being referred to in contemporary terms as an amphiboly. Fancy term. What it means is that one term or one phrase can have multiple meanings, and extracting those meanings becomes important. But I think it's also important to go back to the future, if you will, as Dr. Staub suggested, which was certainly our recommendation as well. We first began these investigations back in 2016 and 2017. Claiming that there's maybe the presence of a functional neurological disorder is important to distinguish by virtue of the words, a disorder of function within the neurological system. That does not equate with a sociogenic effect. It does not equate or equivalently be equal to a psychogenic effect. This is not necessarily a psychosomatic disorder, although there are psychosomatic signs and symptoms that are present and will be present from various forms of functional neurological disorder. So what we're suggesting here is that something happened somewhere in the neurological axis between the inner ear and the brain, and that there are effects uprange, in other words, within the inner ear component, along that trajectory from inner ear to the various networks and nodes of brain function that process that information, and actually within the brain itself. Well, that said, how does one go about the assessment and diagnosis of what these things could be? Well, we've been through that all day. And again, to reiterate, subjective symptomatic reports, I think, are important, but then it becomes much more important to concretize what those subjective feelings are with underlying objective findings. And these are clinical evaluations of the sort that you've heard throughout the day. Neurological and inner ear examinations, examinations of neurological control of movement, motor function, detailed evaluations of cognitive and emotional processing and capabilities of vigilance, concentration, and psychological state, which is functionally important. And I'll explain to you why in a moment, because the psychological state, the individual's emotive capabilities and emotive characteristics may help to shed some light on some of the underlying neural node and network disruptions. And although that is speculative, interestingly, we know that there have been some reports and there have been some investigations from the experimental all the way to the bedside that have demonstrated that certain changes in vestibular function can disrupt the neurochemistry and then literally produce a cascade of neurochemical changes, the result of which is exhibited in clinical signs and symptoms indicative of anxiety and certain forms of agitated depression. You've heard earlier about neuroimaging, and here I think a caveat is important. You know, the neuroimage, and I must tell you, I've been a brain scientist for almost 4 decades. Neuroimaging was an absolute boon. It seemed to be something of a panacea because it allowed us to peer into the living brain, particularly functional neuroimaging. Many of the initial constraints and limitations have been identified and bridged. And there are also forms of neuroimaging that importantly not only look at single sites in the brain, in other words, if you will, certain zip codes and area codes in the brain, but how these are interconnected and what their level of communication is. In other words, examining the networks and nodes and their temporal and spatial interactions. This is referred to as tractography, and it's a very sophisticated form of imaging that would suggest that there may be a functional disruption in the sequence, series, or pattern of the way various brain regions are differentially engaged and activated, which may represent an abnormal state, vis-a-vis some of the Penn findings we saw that suggest not only that there may be some little structural changes that seem to be more representative of something like decompression sickness rather than a concussion, but also functional changes in the way those very specific nodes and networks of the brain process information, not only in the short term, but in the long term. Now, obviously, one of the things we'd look to do is to correlate structure and function. The best ways to do that, you're talking to someone who's trained as neurotoxicologist and pathologist by virtue of anatomy, is to look at things like biopsy or necropsy. That's very difficult, if not impossible, to do within the living brain. Can't take the brain out of someone's head and put it back in. And even biopsying tissue at the level necessary to be able to discern what may be norm from abnorm at that cellular level and that nodal level becomes very, very impossible, and it's highly invasive. There's an ethical barrier there as well, to go probing around within someone's head simply to see if there's something there that may or may not necessarily be present on a neuroimage. The other way to do this is to utilize animal studies and or computational modeling to try to determine what types of things could go wrong in a nervous system, and then back that up deductively or abductively, where you don't have all the information and therefore you're bridging speculation based upon what you know to be able to suggest what might do this. Well, that was an important step because in 2016 and then through 17, 18 into 19, that was exactly the evaluative process. And certainly that process was candidly revealed for the individuals on the National Academy's report, and ultimately was part of the content of what went into the CIA report that was most recently released. We had to examine virtually all the metadata. What we mean by metadata, it's not just what occurred we call in situ, in other words, on site, but also these individuals' prior history, their medical history, their injurious history, their psychological history. The more data, the better. As well, it was very important to correlate the fact that these were individuals who were embedded in an environment and ecology. Could it be that something artifactual or accidental may have occurred with these individuals, even given the best intent, that may have produced these signs and symptoms? Well, the first thing we were concerned about is, well, might there be something psychogenic or sociogenic? And of course, as you heard, the initial presentation and further clarification of the presentation of signs and symptoms is very important in ruling out many of those suspicions early on, and then clarifying that those suspicions were realistically not valid in this case. Break, time out. That's not to say that there are not current exhibits and evidence of a sociogenic and psychogenic phenomenon. Absolutely there are, and we'll get to that momentarily. But it's important to parse, if you will, those prototypic cases from Havana and view those cases in Havana as the lens upon which to view subsequent cases that enter the verification validation pipeline in the appropriate light, with the appropriate shading, and with the appropriate granularity. The possibility was also raised, might it be drugs or chemicals? And there are a number of reasons early on that mitigated those suspicions and then ultimately substantiated that this was not a very strong probability. And certainly, although possible, the probability ultimately came down to a level of almost being nil for a number of reasons: metabolites, environmental residue, etc. The same was true if we were looking at environmental factors. Again, not just drugs, but perhaps chemicals, pesticides, industrial and commercial chemicals that may have been utilized, again, artifactually, with the best intent, but for some reason exhibited certain sensitivities within these individuals that allowed them to present these signs and symptoms. We ruled that out. A number of different patterns mitigated those possibilities and therefore essentially substantiated that that was not the case. So then the question was, what could do this? Well, based upon existing information, research with regard to testing, evaluation, in some cases developmental and applied use, was raised the possibility of some form of directable energy. Well, what type of directable energy? And clearly things that existed within the radio frequency and perhaps electromagnetic range that could be directable via a whole host of possibilities. One is that various forms of both acoustic, that's high sonic, and ultrasonic devices are commercially available for pest repellent. And those devices can also be used to repel human intruders. These are available directly from the internet. There are a number of commercial firms internationally that are available to be able to distribute these products. Could it have been, for example, that an attempt to control pests, whether they were insects or mammalian vermin, that these types of devices may have been installed and utilized in and around the individual's Havana's domicile, where the majority of these effects were incurred? Well, there are a number of reasons here too that mitigated those possibilities and probabilities, not least of which provenance, custodial record, and the types of devices that would need to be used with regard to their locale and the architectures and geometries of the rooms themselves. But what this then allowed us to do is to examine in greater detail the technological readiness level, the TRL, of forms of energy that could be directed in ways that would be scalable, fieldable, and therefore operationalizable. Now, again, please understand that there's information that I simply cannot discuss in an open forum such as this. Some of it exists as confidential, unclassified, and some still remains on the high side. But suffice it to say that information, both at the time, 2016, 17, part of 18, and then subsequently 18 and 19, again, primarily through our working with international groups in conjunction with Donovan Fellowship at Special Operations Command, revealed that there were two primary domains of directable energy that represented not only state of the science and technology, but were at a point of technological readiness that would allow or enable possible deployability and operational use. The idea of utilizing acoustic rangeable devices in the high sonic and/or ultrasonic range, very possible, very probable. The possibility of also utilizing some form of microwave energy, particularly low to moderate gigawatt microwave energy that could be generated using very, very rapid pulsing, perhaps utilizing a light source, a laser source, to be able to develop nanosecond or perhaps even quicker pulsing, would allow the scalability, the fieldability, and the containability of microwaves, and also get by some of the power source requirements that might be necessary. Why would such devices be in operation? Well, this too, I think, is a little above my pay grade and out of my sandbox, but suffice it to understand that these types of devices can be used for surveillance, and/or they can be used either kinetically or non-kinetically for disruptive effects. What do we mean by that? What we mean is that there are a number of nations worldwide that have dedicated effort to employing these devices for testing organic and inorganic substances, primarily from the occupational and commercial range. If we take a look at these nations, they include the United States and many of its allies, China, Russia, among others. So the technology exists. We know the technology is being employed, at least in part, for the evaluation of vulnerability and volatility for organic and inorganic substances. To do what? Well, this is where it gets interesting, because what may be possibly going on here in terms of the actual effects comes to these conclusions. This probably represented, in most, of course, based upon our probabilistic inference, a non-accidental exposure to some form of directable energy source. Acoustic effects, possibly. Could it be an artifact of some surveillance? Perhaps a surveillance effort gone wrong? Perhaps. Might it have been an intentionally disruptive engagement? Perhaps. Could it be some combination of these two above? Yes. But it does also reflect and therefore represent an awareness and knowledge and recognition of the current level of technological sophistication, capability, scalability, and operationalizability. In other words, it is now an important factor to understand that these types of technologies have progressed in the past 2 decades to get to a point where the available technologies, when used convergently, can create devices that are scalable, fieldable, and operationalizable, not for mass destruction, but for rather granular disruption on a variety of levels, from the cells all the way up to the socioeconomic. That said, it also becomes exceedingly important to understand what these devices might do. Dr. Staub brought up a very, very important point. In a prior life, I also had background and training in bioengineering and biomechanics. And if we look at the way energy resources, a variety of different types of applied energy, might affect different tissues, we have to consider their structure. And there are a number of ways this occurs. Number one is the energy field itself approaches the structure. There's the possibility for an effect known as hysteresis. In other words, the effect in the actual tissue or the structure that is being affected occurs somewhat later than the actual onset or even offset of the stimulus. But one of the things this can do is this can push these tissues or these structures to what's called their non-linear range. So health in any structure or any function is essentially non-linear adaptive. It has a high level, it has a low level, and it doesn't just sit passively in between, rather it moves. But if you apply stimulation to a way that increases the response in whatever that substance is, its functional response, it need not necessarily be destructive per se, but what it does is it then induces a phenomenon called biomechanical creep. Well said. In other words, the system creeps towards its most linear high end, and as a consequence, it resets. Now, when we reset physiological systems, understand they have a structure, a physical structure, and that physical structure begets a variety of functions. Structure and function are interactive throughout our biology. And this is particularly the case in those key functions whereby a structure such as the inner ear directly interacts with neurological inputs and outputs. And it may very well be that by distorting the structure and its function, we then hyper-engage those neurological feed forward mechanisms to then have what's called a hyperexcitatory effect. Interestingly, one of the things we know that occurs in many forms of structural and functional vestibular disorders is that the nature of the inner ear disruption can actually cause neurochemical changes in the brain. This is not a lecture in neuropharmacology or neurochemistry, but if we look, quote, downrange, one of the things we find is that increased excitability within the neurovestibular pathway can increase the activity of glutamate, an excitatory neurotransmitter, in a number of different brain nodes and networks, inclusive of those that process vestibular input and the coordination areas of the brain, inclusive of an area called the insula and the anterior and medial cingulate gyrus. As the glutamate function increases, one of the things that can happen is that you then see an overlevel of excitation. It's called hyperexcitosis. And as a consequence, those individual nerve cells and nerve networks reset themselves in a way that is now abnormally disruptive. Curiously, what we also know is as glutamate levels tend to increase, serotonin levels in the brain, in those key nodes and networks, seem to be decreasing because they're not able to keep pace with that level of neurochemical imbalance. Please understand, that was a very, very simplistic explanation of how these pathways work. And we can't reduce everything down to simple neurochemical imbalances. But it is noteworthy that those antidepressant drugs that are highly serotonergic, that work as serotonin transporter inhibitors and or that work upstream, have also been shown to be highly effective against various forms of persistent postural vertigo. And also by reducing some of the sympathetic nervous system activity that can occur in result of vertigo, can also bring back some of the cognitive emotional stability. And this, of course, we know is important. So one of the things that we're considering is that you're not really seeing one thing or the other, that you may have seen some form of structural disruption that may be caused by vibration and or distortion incurred through some form of directed energy that may have produced ripples, if you will, effects, anomalous effects downstream within the nervous system to reset the nervous system in those ways that now disposes that individual towards the types of things we see with these forms of vertiginous defects as described by Dr. Staub and others. So the question then becomes, could these technologies do this? Yes, they could. Could these technologies also induce something which has been referred to earlier in the chat as the Frey effect? And in part, yes, they could. What you see here is that any of these technologies, the sonic technologies and or the non-thermal microwave technologies, are capable of inducing an energetic disruption in either solid tissue or in fluid tissue. And certainly, please understand, you have both solid and fluid tissues in the deep inner ear as well as in the brain. And that causes those tissues to roil, to sort of bubble. As a consequence, that bubbling leads to instability. It's referred to as a cavitation effect. We also know that some of those cavitation effects are possible to be translated not only from the fluid of the inner ear, but from the bloodstream of the inner ear to the vasculature that then goes into the brain, particularly the forward area of the brain in and around the branches of the cerebral artery that also affect one of the areas that is, in fact, a target area, the insula. Is it possible that the combination of these effects produces this constellation of features? And this is what we're seeing on a level from the cell all the way to the systemic, and on the level from the very personal all the way to the populational? It is. Is that speculation? Yes, of course it is. Is it speculation based upon modeling? Yes, absolutely. But one of the things that becomes equally important is to resort to something called ex ubantibus reasoning. In other words, if we have certain interventions, treatments, if you will, and we know how those treatments work, and those treatments are effective in individuals who are presenting with certain signs and symptoms, well, then one can create, if you will, an analysis, an analytic conclusion that something that those treatments are doing are affecting that mechanism we know those treatments work on, which may have gone wrong in these individuals. Is there room for error there? There's always room for error. Is it therefore possible, and thus based upon the efforts to date and the metadata coming not only from the patients in Havana, but some of those who are in the verification and validation pipeline, that the effects that they're seeing in terms of their clinically observable signs, and the symptoms that they produce may be due to an incurred effect by some form of external stimulus that was able to disrupt inner ear and inner ear to neurological functions in one or more ways? Yes. So what do we do about it? For those of you who are into philosophy, the question here is, how do we shave with Occam's razor while sailing in von Neurath's boat? In other words, how do we try to keep the approach simple while we've already launched? Let me explain what I mean by that. It's important to understand that if nothing else comes out of these cases in Havana and all of the media and attention that has been subsequent to that, must be an awareness that the science and technology has advanced to a point where such tools and techniques are usable and deployable in non-kinetic and kinetic operations. This is not new. This is not magic. We've known this for years. We've seen the technologies as viable for years, and many of the constraints and limits for the actual deployability and usability of these technologies have been bridged, have been compensated for by bringing several technologies together with regard to things like laser science, nanoscience, the use of various forms of engineering, and a more detailed understanding of how the brain and or physiological systems work. So what we've called for is that in addressing these, we do this in a way that is practically wise. Fancy term here, coming from Aristotle. Aristotle called practical wisdom phronesis. And what we've called for is a phronetic approach. And how it works is quite simple. Any ethical address, analysis, and articulation of what could be done and what should be done must proceed from fact. One of the facts is that there are abundant cases that reflect a sociogenic and psychogenic phenomenon. Individuals who are the worried well, individuals who conflate signs and symptoms of pre-existing or current other disorders to be possibility for Havana syndrome, individuals who may have some form of psychological overlay. It becomes important to distinguish those clades of signs and symptoms. And it becomes equally important to understand that the possibilities certainly exist, that there are technologies out there that are capable of inducing these types of disruptions. And therefore, we need to increase the granularity, specificity, and sophistication of how we look. As Dr. Staub said, this is a 21st century problem. 21st century problems demand 21st century address and answers. Obviously, the ethics must be devoted to the enterprise. And if we're talking about something that has both a public health component as well as a national safety and security component, then please understand that those directed efforts may not necessarily always be transparent. What must be transparent is the directive, intent, motivation, and dedication to, in fact, apply efforts, energies, and endeavors towards getting the necessary address, acknowledging the problem, coming up with answers, and finding solutions. Why? Because realistically, we understand that these things are out there, and therefore we must develop those techniques and technologies that are far more sophisticated and capable in evaluating if and when such types of technologies are being utilized against individuals in a variety of different settings, from bellicose combative settings to more terrorist type public settings that equally have value with regard to creating a disruptive effect, but can also create a tremendous psychogenic and sociological effect based upon the ripple manifestations that can occur among, again, populations of the worried well as just the disruptive effects of not knowing if a particular thing has happened or not. Clarification and awareness is critical here as a first step. The second important step is quantification. What really is the actual quantifiable burden, risk, harm, and threat of these types of things occurring? And obviously, how do we then detect it? Well, much of what you've heard today, inclusive of the past two lectures, have addressed possible underlying physiological mechanisms. And I've described to you those most probabilistic inferences of what kinds of things could cause these. So this throws down the gauntlet of both challenge and opportunity to develop programs and projects to create devices for detection, mitigation, and prevention. And the good news is that such efforts are currently underway, not only here in the United States, but worldwide. But again, I think this also bespeaks the idea of practical wisdom. And along with this, I think one must appreciate that there needs to be some degree of relative or non-transparency. Let me explain why. This is not saying that these things occur in dark laboratories hidden away somewhere in malevolent ways. But let's face it, if one of the things we're acknowledging is that there are techniques, technologies, and science that are available on the global stage that can be rendered and utilized via a variety of actors, whether they're state actors or non-state actors, to incur disruptive effects. What you don't want to do is open your playbook on Friday and truly expect to win the game on Saturday. In other words, understanding what's going on, understanding the technology readiness level, and then developing the necessary responses may not necessarily be the most fully transparent paradigm. For simple reasons is that you don't want to throw your cards. What we've called for is something called prudent parentalism, not paternalism, parentalism. In other words, it becomes important for those institutions, organizations, individuals, and resources that are working in these protective ways to assure those that they are protecting that such protective efforts are underway. Think of a good parent. What the good parent does is informs as best possible to the level of understanding, and at the same time informs so as to continue to keep that individual they're protecting out of harm's way. This is not always as easy as one would think. I mean, clearly the idea to fight for right and freedom, but at the same time keep your honor clean. Well, one of the issues here is that there may be something of a technology brinksmanship, if you will, a science and technology race, whereby one group makes one set of discoveries and creates certain types of technological readiness. And then the response is that other groups must in fact play catch up. And clearly what this then implies is that there is some form of an ongoing effort. So what we have called for is something called a CARE concept, which is the considerate articulation of realities, responsibility, and expectation. And what I mean by considerate is be considerate of all the variables. Certainly most considerate is the primacy of those who are being affected, those who have been harmed, those who have been burdened. That's critical. But equally considerate is how we then acknowledge and respond to those things in ways that do not increase the potential for further risk and harm, not only to those who have been affected, but to others. Reliable and responsible treatment of the individuals. Dedicated, ongoing programs of surveillance of neuroscience, technology, research, developmental test and evaluation worldwide. Transparency as to what's going on in those programs by virtue of, in some cases, cooperation and collaboration, even with international competitors. Certainly public communication of the process, which is why I applaud forums like the one we have here today. Responsible oversight, governance and control, and the engagement of multidisciplinary advisory groups, such as the national academies that address these anomalous health incidences. But more than that, understanding the science and technology is making inroads, and those inroads can be used in a variety of ways, some for healing, some for harming, also puts incumbent responsibilities upon the current and future iterations of things like the Biological Toxins and Weapons Convention. And here I'm enthused and optimistically can report to you that a number of groups, most notably the Australia group to the review committee of the Biological Toxins and Weapons Convention, has advocated that now we begin to consider these devices and these technologies as potential bioweapons. And I'm proud to say that some of the groups that I've worked with, the National Defense University, at the Naval War College, within the DoD, Special Operations Command and intelligence community, have also called for a change in the posture of how the language of these treaties is devised, developed, articulated, and sustained. But equally important is the fact that these techniques and technologies have become ever more the province of multiple nation states on the global stage. And therefore, that ongoing level of multinational surveillance and engagement is critical, but so is an appreciation of the various socio-cultural factors that would propel various nation states to engage in this type of research, number one, and to possibly use it. understanding that tools are out there, that the science exists, is not the same as saying the science is being used. I mean, it's one thing you don't want to say, well, the sky is falling or crying wolf. You don't want to do that. But you do want to look up, take a look at the clouds and say, you know, today looks like rain, and what are we going to do to prepare for it? So what we're calling for going forward, quo vadis, is to cash this thing, the reality check, with regard to our perspective, our humility in that science by its nature must be self-critical and self-revising. And at the same time, the scientific approaches to not only detection, mitigation, and prevention, but how we treat those who have been affected with something must remain equally flexible, equally humble. And certainly, I think there's a sense of gratitude for the achievements that have been accomplished so far, to put them in the proper perspective. What this actually calls for, ladies and gentlemen, is that we adapt those procedures that work, if you will, left of bang. To understand what bang are the risks, harms, and threats that exist, and it becomes increasingly important based upon our awareness of the sophistication and capabilities of the science and technology to employ equal effort with detailed endeavor and enterprise to, in many ways, define how that science and technology could be so used, both beneficially as well as bellicosely, to understand not only the benefits, but also the burdens and harms that could be incurred by various uses of those technologies. And then to also be prepared. And prepared means readiness. Readiness means not only qualification, identification, and awareness of the risks, threats, and harms, but also vigilance, preparedness for detection, mitigation, and prevention. Because the thing we don't want to do is we don't want to devote efforts to science and technologies aimed at unraveling this sort of Gordian knot of the way the brain, the nervous system, and our physiology functions, only to open a can of worms in the way that these techniques and technologies could be used, might have been used, and may continue to be used in ways that are damaging to individuals, to the public, and to national safety and security. For those of you who are interested in our ongoing work, not only dealing with the Havana syndrome since 2016, but addressing some of the capabilities of neuroscience and technology, along with other areas of bioscience and tech that could be applied in these ways, and what needs to be done to address and mitigate these risks and threats, I provide that information for you here. And for those of you who wish to get in touch with me, please feel free. You can reach me at james.giordano@georgetown.edu. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and open this up for the possibility of questions if we have any.
Thank you, Dr. Giordano, excuse me, for a fascinating presentation. I'm going to paraphrase a couple of questions that go along some of the themes that you've articulated, particularly in the last part of your talk. One is, are there any sensors being developed that can sort of, in a proactive way, as shown in your last slide, help mitigate against these type of technological threats, things that you're able to comment on in this open forum? And secondly, have any scientists done further work in terms of trying to replicate a device that can mimic this and be ethically tested, similar to the device that the two University of Michigan engineering students developed back in 2017 to mimic the sounds that somebody had posted on the internet that they thought were the sounds they heard?
Yeah, so let me just speak first to the idea of the sounds, and it sounded like crickets. So the sounds appear to be an artifact actually of the waveform based upon the architecture and geometry of where the individual was relative to the, if you will, incurring stimulus. We know, for example, that rangeable acoustic devices, particularly those in the high sonic and ultrasonic range, have a very specific cone of effect. But if you move outside of that cone, or if you move in such a way as to divert or to distort the architecture and geometries, there may very well be, if you will, an auditory effect, a palpable sensory acoustic effect. And this was alluded to earlier. In other words, it need not necessarily damage the tissue. It only takes the tissue to its upper limit, and as a consequence, then distorts the function and structure of that tissue and therefore resets it. that may be palpable, that may be tangible, that may be sensed, and that may be part of the thing that people have heard, so to speak. And again, there's individual variation based upon a whole host of things. Literally, the shape of the skull, the architectonics of bone, coupled with the architecture and geometry of the room, and where these individuals were moving with regard to the biophysical wave. But it's important to understand that in some cases, there may be an acoustic signature. That acoustic signature may be auditory or may be para-auditory, but that then brings us up to the prior point. Could we utilize some of these characteristics as viable criteria for detection, number one, and number two, mitigation? The short answer is yes. The intermediate answer is I'm very encouraged by some of the dedicated efforts most recently that I've become aware of. And the longer answer is obviously that information at this point remains at very, very least confidential and unclassified information, and at most in the classified space. And you would imagine that this could or should not be discussed. Suffice it to say that efforts are underway, and I'm encouraged by those efforts that I've been aware of to date.
We have some other questions. We have a question. What steps would you recommend for civilian patients who've been given diagnoses similar to those of embassy personnel by Dr. Hoffer and his group in Miami?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And I must tell you, I receive a number of emails and a number of correspondences from individuals who have reports in which they're reporting certainly symptoms and in some cases validatable signs. I think what becomes very, very important is for them to seek clinical assistance, seek clinical aid, first and foremost. Why? Well, clearly they're suffering, something is wrong, find out what is wrong. That also helps to provide objective evidence that there are dysfunctional parameters and abnormalities, which would then be important to feed, if you will, up the chain. So these could then be further evaluated. And there are a number of evaluative programs, as we know, operative right now in the United States, into which that information would then be uptaken. So the individuals might then progress into the verification and validation pipelines.
Okay. Thank you very much. We're going to now shift into a panel mode, which Dr. Cullum is going to organize, where we're going to have several of the panelists will answer any questions that people have that haven't already been answered during their individual presentations. I want to thank all of you for attending the conference today. This ends the formal part of the conference. We'll have some Q&A for about 15 to 20 minutes. And we will be posting these talks and slide decks on the UT Southwestern website sometime within the next few weeks. So those who are interested, follow our Twitter handle, UT Southwestern Psychiatry, or the O'Donnell Brain Institute handle on Twitter, UT Southwestern Brain Institute, and you'll see when those come up. When those who are unable to hear the entire presentation or who missed the conference and want to hear it, we certainly would welcome your input. If you enjoyed the conference, feel free to reach out to the speakers and let them know. I again want to give special thanks to all of our speakers from UT Southwestern, to Dr. Staub, to Dr. Giordano, and to our other guests who kind of gave us the 30,000-foot view of the national security implications of Havana syndrome, to Suzanne Kelly, Dan Hoffman, Greg Meyer, and Mark Polymeropoulos for sharing his own personal story of how he experienced Havana syndrome and the advocacy work that he's done. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Cohen. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here, and thank for our panelists who are remaining. I know some people had to jump off, so not everyone is here. I have some questions I've collected throughout the chat throughout the day. They've been quite extensive. I've tried to cull through them as much as possible. And some are to the panel in general, and others are directed to some of the individuals here. So I will just start with one of the general, panel question. This might be in Dr. Giordano's area a little bit more, but are you aware of any support available to individuals who have collected evidence that they likely have been subjected to directed energy forces? How would you advise these people to handle their collection of this information?
That's a really good question. There are a number of different avenues that one could pursue. One clearly would be to have one's attending physician either contact one of the individuals here, for example, and me inclusive, and or to contact Walter Reed National Medical Center. Clearly, as you know, the Walter Reed Medical Center was one of the central depositories and repositories for treating those individuals with the prototypic cases. And referral to Walter Reed might be an important venue, but that would have to be a physician-based referral. So again, I think it's very important to have, if you will, the clinical advocacy that the individual who's been affected is considered to be representative and therefore requires some verification and validation. And that would really get the wheels rolling. I hope that answers your question.
Great, I hope so as well. Dr. Staub, your model of illness as overlapping Venn diagrams piqued some people's interest. Sounds like a network analysis type of approach. Is your group exploring statistical ways of analyzing these collected data?
So that's a great question. The answer is yes. We have started with some really first generation AI tools to try and get at some of this. I mean, AI really, it is just a technology to allow us to see patterns that we couldn't otherwise see. It's going to take some time to develop that, and it's also important that there are limits to what AI can do, and that based on what data we can provide it. So some the process is going to be sort of what we think now, test it, see whether or not that's right, and kind of retest it. But yes, those processes are getting started.
That's terrific. I also understand that for those types of analyses, you need actually really large numbers. So that'll be an ongoing thing for a while.
Yeah, that it's yes and no. It depends on the kind of question that you're asking. So if some questions can be asked with data sets in the hundreds, but those are relatively simple, straightforward, but still kind of intriguing questions. So we don't have to say, oh my goodness, we can't do anything until we see 1 million patients. If we see a couple of hundred to a few thousand, there are certain questions that AI can help us answer.
Terrific. So this mainly to the physicians on the panel. When tinnitus occurs, how often do you find that you can actually infer an etiology? And what percentage of cases are just spontaneous? Just people walking around and suddenly they have this experience in the absence of any suspected exposure to anything?
I'll take that question, Dr. Cullum. I've seen a number of the patients that I've seen that have PPPD and vestibular migraine also have associated tinnitus. And sometimes it's related to the syndrome presentation, but there have been other cases where the patients have said, oh, I've had tinnitus for many years, but it didn't bother me and it's become worse. And I try to use Dr. Kutz's approach that he mentioned in his talk this morning, which is to think of tinnitus not really as being an otologic illness, but really the brain kind of tricking the patient. But it can be a very disabling symptom for patients, and in severe cases has to be taken very seriously because it's associated with a higher incidence of suicidal ideation and frank hopelessness. One of the fortunate things we found that helps tinnitus sufferers is low-dose benzodiazepine medications are often helpful, not because they make the tinnitus go away, but they somehow help the brain reframe how it perceives it. And the other thing that many sufferers of tinnitus have found very helpful is an app developed by a tinnitus sufferer in the UK. It's called Quieten, like the word quiet, E-N. And I've had tinnitus patients who told me about the app, which I share with my other patients, and they found it very, very helpful.
Great. This may be a question more for Dr. Lane or Dr. Lakritz or Dr. Well, actually several of you, but some patients with these unexplained symptoms don't feel like their doctors believe them. How do you handle that? How do you advise patients to approach their healthcare providers to address these issues so that they will feel listened to? That's a tough one, I know.
Thank you for asking that question. And this is something in my clinic that I hear from patients who may have gone to several providers or other contexts before making it to a neuropsychiatry clinic, where this is not an uncommon experience. And I don't know if there's a magic sentence or a magic word. In fact, I imagine there's not, to be able to walk into an appointment and avoid those moments, those unfair and undeserved moments where someone isn't feeling heard. But I think if I were to have any advice around this question, it would be to try to communicate to your provider the suffering that you're living with, to communicate to your provider how this is impacting your life and keeping you from living the quality of life that you want and that we know you deserve. And hopefully that will be able to, if not, allow the provider to think about what diagnoses it could be, or the causes of the syndrome that you might be living with. At least it reminds your provider of the humanity of why you're in their office, why you're in their clinic. And that might be able to tap into a common page, a shared page where you can work together on that.
Anything else to add to that? I think that's a nice response.
I'll chime in as an ethicist. I mean, I think it's important to remember that the nature of the clinical encounter is an asymmetrical one. If the patient could diagnose or treat themselves, they wouldn't be there. And so it's a question of need, which then goes back to that humanitarian encounter of an individual who professes to be able to assess and then intervene, and the individual who needs that. And that level of intervention may not be cure, and very often it's not, but at very, very least, it should approach some level of healing. So the idea is cure when capable, treat as best possible, but care always, which I think really bespeaks what Dr. Lane has said.
Can I jump in here just for one quick second as one of the someone who's experienced this? It was, one of the most kind of disheartening times. It was in 2018 when I was seeing multiple doctors all over the Northern Virginia area and having to explain over and over again what happened. I think, and so finally, when I finally got to Walter Reed and I found an institution that actually believed me, that was extraordinary. But I think one of the key things is kind of, it's just patient knowledge that there are places like, and everyone here is representative of an institution that actually is treating this and believes in it. And so there has to be, awareness on the part of those who need to be treated to go to the right place, because there is nothing worse. I saw so many different doctors, even to the point where, I had a vertigo episode about 2 months ago. And I remember being on the phone with Walter Reed and they told me to get to, Fairfax Hospital and trying to explain this to the emergency room, what was happening. Literally, it was to the point where actually I elected not to. I didn't tell them anything about direct, Havana syndrome, AHIs, any of that. It was more of, am I having a stroke and dying right now? I need a CT scan, because Walter Reed gave me the instructions. You need a CT scan. That's it. So that it is so incredibly frustrating for patients if you especially kind of in the introduction to new doctors. But the point is that there are so many more people out there, like everyone on this panel, who is treating this. So there are so many more options, and that is critical. When people call me and they say, "Where should I go?" There are many more options than there were several years ago, and so that's a really good thing, because there's nothing worse than not being believed, or even kind of that arched eyebrow. Or rolling in with a big stack of medical files, for a very rushed and hurried medical staff. So I commend all you for kind of being involved in this, but I think it's getting the education out that there are people who can treat this.
Yeah, let me add something to that, because again, one of the hats I wear is as one of the senior bioethicists to an organization called the DMEC, which is the Defense Medical Ethics Center out of Walter Reed. An important consideration is exactly as Mark has said. Number one, it's getting to the right clinicians to understand this, and I think that's critical. The other thing is that there's been a tremendous amount of miscommunication about this thing called Havana syndrome, and the fact that there is an ongoing discourse, a dialogue about psychogenic and sociogenic effects, tends to sort of devolve everything down to that as a final common denominator. I think what's very important to get out there is that there are notable cases that are in a verification and validation pipeline that represent something other than a sociogenic and a psychogenic effect. It becomes critically important. I mean, the first step in medicine is what is wrong with this patient, then what can be done, and then what should be done. Practical question is, can you really do what you should? But I think it also is critical, as Dr. Staub and others have said, is to understand what is the constellation that would represent sociogenic and psychogenic effects, as well as possible psychological overlay. But to also understand that there's something really here that doesn't rule out that there are psychogenic and sociogenic effects. There are. It doesn't rule out that individuals have pre-existing or coexisting conditions that have many of the same signs and symptoms that may be conflated. There are. But it's equally important to understand that there's something here, and we need to get a much clearer clinical picture of that, if nothing else epidemiologically, to understand the magnitude of the effect, as well as to understand how to best approach it. So Mark, your point is very, very well taken.
And one of the things that I would add is this may not help people as they approach the sort of the first interaction with their physicians or other clinicians, but we try to help people re-engage with their home docs when they come to see us in the following way. I say to patients, I apologize for not on behalf of their doctor, but I say, look, I bet your home clinicians were trained the same way I was in this old model. If it's either in a laboratory test or it's all in your head, that's the way we were trained. That's the way we thought back then. It wasn't right. We know that now. And so let's see if we can help you kind of recognize that that's when your doctor, your nurse practitioner, whoever the clinician may be, was trained. But let's see if we can't kind of break through a little bit and kind of overcome that. And that usually, because most people, like Mark described, have been through that process, and by the time they do get to us, it's become such a sore point that trying to take a little bit of that pain away and explain that, hey, this is about all of us who were trained in the 20th century, and we all got to move forward. And when I say to patients, it's changing but not change ed, that kind of clicks a little bit with them to try and so that they can work with the home docs a bit.
That actually, I think, nicely addressed a couple of the other questions that relate to that, which is sort of, how do we get the word out? How do we educate the new generation of physician and healthcare providers? And is this group interested in doing any sort of information pamphlet? I'll take that up with the group later, but I think that was a good response. As far as risks to the developing brain, why don't we hear more about kids being affected? Are the numbers just too small of the kids being in these environments? Or we know in concussion that child brains tend to be more vulnerable to the effects of concussion. They may take longer to recover. What about it in this condition? Anybody or everybody on that one?
Let me give you a national security perspective. One of the questions I saw pop up in the chat referred to intent. Certainly above my pay grade and out of my sandbox with regard to attribution and potential intent. But the overall intent in utilizing these most sophisticated devices in these ways, I think, really harkens back to a very, very literal definition of a weapon. In other words, it's means of contending against others in ways that are disruptive. It doesn't need to be destructive, disruptive. The disruptions can occur on a variety of levels. It can be physical disruption, social disruption, psychological disruption, economic disruption. And essentially what that does is that creates rippling effects. So it becomes important to think, well, what are valuable targets, sites, loci, and foci for disruptive effects? And I think if we examine some of the individuals who are prototypically affected in Havana, that answer becomes pretty obvious. But I think the larger issue is that there's the need for increased vigilance, preparedness, and understanding that a variety of tools and techniques, technologies, and science could be rendered more generally against the public, inclusive of those we hold near and dear, kin and kith, children inclusive, to have disruptive effects, not necessarily in the short term, but in the intermediate and long term. And as Dr. Staub said, what that then calls forth is the need to increase education and training to be just aware of what's, quote, out there. I mean, let's face it, before microbe theory, we were talking about miasma, and then everything changed. Well, this isn't exactly a sea change, but it is really, I think, a call to remain aware and pace with what the science and technology can do and how it might be misused in those ways that are nefarious.
Dr. Curl, I would add a bit of a positive note about younger children anyway, in two regards. And I'm not trying to be Pollyannish about this, but rather bring some information that we know about functional disorders and about trauma for younger children. Persistent functional syndromes, to the extent that any element of this is functional, persistent functional syndromes are less common in young children than they are in adolescents and adults. They have lots of transient ones. Any kid who's run off in first grade to, with a tummy ache because they're scared of school, has a functional syndrome. But persistent ones are less common in young children. And second is that young children look to their home environment largely for the recovery period. So if they have a secure home environment after a traumatic experience, the likelihood that they'll go on to persistent traumatic stress related kinds of problems is less. Once kids get into adolescence and begin to have their home environment be less important to them than their peer environment, they lose a little bit of that protection. So I think that's not to say that young children are invulnerable to this from a biological standpoint, but that the psychological social factors are more in their favor than perhaps teenagers or young adults.
Good answer. Another question was, has anyone tried to study civilians who feel they may have been suffering from similar symptoms or exposed to such conditions? Anything in the literature that anybody's aware of along those lines?
Yeah, there's evidence coming from some of the international literature for individuals who've been exposed to various forms of rangeable and non-rangeable acoustic stimuli, both in the auditory range as well as the ultrasonic range. Certainly, we know there's a lot of work having been done on the Fry effect, and there is a body of literature, both international and some of it domestic, with regard to the effects of scalable, pulsable microwaves that exist below the thermal artifact level.
Is anyone aware of any movement toward funding opportunities for research in this area? Or is the DoD interested in this? NIH talking about funding ongoing projects in addition to the one NIH funding that was mentioned earlier?
Well, I think, let me just start the conversation. I think it's important and noteworthy that the current administration has allocated $33 million towards the overarching construct and consideration of what we're calling Havana syndrome, and that money has a number of different silos, inclusive of a research and development silo that could be utilized for things like detection and mitigation.
I can add to that, Dr. Cullum, as well. I think with the creation of ARPA for Health, we'll see more monies looking at these type of complex illnesses, whether they're neuroscience type of conditions or pandemics, future pandemics. I think one of the things that has been highlighted by Dr. Giordano and Dr. Staub is that from DARPA's point of view and the government's point of view, i.e. an ARPA Health, the biggest threats to our workforce in these spaces, the military, the diplomats, as Ambassador Rubin pointed out, and as Mark Polymeropoulos and Dan Hoffman pointed out, to our intelligence community overseas, and to our country here, vis-a-vis the pandemic, are these types of 21st century challenges. So I think this is all very brand new and was codified in last year by President Biden, and it's just starting now. There's still decisions being made that just recently that ARPA Health will likely be housed in the Department of Health and Human Services rather than NIH. But I think we will see more in that regard. While I have the mic, I have a question for Dr. Giordano and Dr. Staub. There's been a lot of, both of you mentioned the role of the insular cortex, and Dr. Marty Paulus at the Laureate Institute in Tulsa has done a lot of work with his colleagues on this looking at, there were published papers looking at special forces soldiers and the different types of stressful training they had. And they showed on functional MRI changes in the insular cortex and its activation or deactivation. Could you comment on that? And do you think that might have applicability, that whole idea of interoception, of how the brain maps its external experience onto the insular cortex?
I'll start and then I'll hand it over to you, Jeff, if I could. On the basic science or on the translational science side, I think that caution needs to be taken when examining, for example, structural changes in brain with what might be ecological inputs. In other words, to say that the insula changes in some way or that the amygdala changes in some way. Well, that's sort of a non-directional change. What does change in size or change in particular densities of cells and or what's called dendritic ratios mean? But I think it is important to understand that those changes, particularly if those changes represent an acute or subacute change, also may represent a certain level of plasticity. So to demonstrate that an ecological event, an environmental event, whether it's in training or with some experience, then induces that level of structural effect that may have some functional correlates. I think that's the real challenge, is to be able to say, all right, we have these things that occur in this individual's environment, education, training, experience. We see that there are the sort of these pre versus post changes with regard to a baseline in various what's called regions of interest or areas of interest in the brain. And then the question is, well, what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of neurological functional effects? And then how do those changes in neurological network activity translate into viable changes in cognition, emotionality, or behaviors, which then clearly then gets us into the intersectional translational clinical realm. Jeff, over to you, sir.
Yeah, I would just follow up on that, Jim, and it is that the very interesting sort of semi-famous study done on London black cab drivers a few years ago, showing that they had larger hippocampi than the average person. Now, to become in the old days, London before back before GPS and so forth, to get licensed as a London cab driver, you had to know the city map by road and pass a test. And so there was great memorization of geographic that was required for that job, and it showed up as an increase in hippocampal volumes. And so going from a function and a focus of a function on an area of the brain and basically exercising that area of the brain led to a change in its structure. And so functional changes can beget structural changes in a positive, not just negative way. The second thing I would say about the insula is it's very important to know what parts of the insula. The insula from posterior to anterior moves from sort of sensory processing to spatial processing to a sensory emotional integration in a relatively small area. So it's important to know where and then to have those functional and symptom correlates.
Earlier today, the issue of control groups has come up for research in this area. What are people's thoughts about who would be some of the best control groups? What other populations do we really need to compare this population to get at the answers that we think we need?
I'll start that one first, Dr. Conlon. I think that, there were a couple of people today who offered populations that have overlapping symptoms. So I think the first question that we have to ask is, what aspect of this are we trying to test? Because if we're trying to test for perpetuating factors that may be in the psychological, social, environmental realm, then thinking about patients who are developing long COVID, patients who had Gulf War syndrome, patients who have persistent, post mild concussive syndromes, they may be good comparisons because there are some of those overlapping kinds of problems. But if we're looking at something that's more etiologic in terms of the original insult, then we have to be a little, then mixing those kind of groups wouldn't necessarily get at the kind of problems that we want. So I think the first question is, what question are we asking? Is there an active illness group that overlaps, but we think may have unique aspects, and then a normal population? So normal, active illness, that reflects the question being answered or asked rather, and then the population, the Havana population of interest.
Good answer. I'll ask, oh, go ahead.
Also add to that, when I worked overseas as a regional psychiatrist and medical officer, part of what we would do, all of the medical people and psychiatrists would do, is give talks to the embassy communities about health hazards and stressors overseas. And I'll never forget, I got asked this question all the time, and Ambassador Rubin touched on it in his fine talk, which is, we take a group of people who are typically in their early to late 20s, and they join the diplomatic corps as specialists or as generalists, and they typically serve for 20 years in mostly difficult and challenging and even dangerous environments. And the question I would get asked by a first tour person overseas is, I'm going to be overseas for 20 years. Is this bad for my health? I always got asked that question. So I think in terms of a control group, what is needed is a larger population-based study where you take a class of entering diplomats. It's going to be about 100 to 200 people, and you follow them out. And you would have to have an academic center that would manage this study. Sort of think of it as the grant study, but for diplomats. And the other thing I wanted to point out for the panelists and our listeners is the GAO is just recently, they're going to have congressional subcommittee hearings on the overseas mental health of our diplomats and exactly these type of questions and what can be done. So those would be the control groups. The other question that is implicit in this, really for Dr. Giordano, is we know that these places such as Havana are very stressful places to live and work. Moscow, where I spent 5 years, is very stressful. Other war zones that Mark Polymeropoulos served in, a lot of stressors are put on the health of our diplomatic personnel and their families overseas. So what's peculiar is these stressors are enduring and have been around for decades. So why did we only see this now in 2016 and onwards? And maybe Dr. Giordano can comment about that.
Yeah, we gave a series of briefings to our colleagues in the Department of State, particularly as regards to their services for health, well-being, and medical oversight of individuals who are going to be deployed to OCONUS, so outside the continental United States. And one of their concerns was exactly as you've said. I mean, that the standard was to brief individuals and prepare individuals for what would be considered, if you will, run-of-the-mill burdens, risks, and harms. Local disease threats, the sort of issues that go on with sort of the socio-cultural issues with the general population, the average thing you would tend to see with preventative or occupational medicine with those types of deployment. But I think one of the things that was conspicuously absent is an awareness that the current sophistication of the science and technology could be utilized in those ways that presented potential harms and threats to individuals who might be so deployed. And that was one of the points that was drilled home for us. In other words, look, given the increasing sophistication and capability of these various things and their viability for dual use, shouldn't this be in the repertoire of things that we're at least briefed about and understand that there may be the possibility, if not risk and threat, of being exposed in these ways? So number one, what can be done to detect it? Number two, what can be done to treat it? And number three, what could be done to mitigate it or prevent it? And the answer to the question is, yeah, you're absolutely right. But I'll go one step further. It's not just a question of individuals who are deployed overseas. Yeah, I mean, clearly they represent probably the low-hanging fruit in the first tier of perhaps viably affected individuals who may be in harm's way. But the accessibility of the science and technology, inclusive, I must say, of the possibility for do-it-yourself. Not to say that the do-it-yourself community is in any way capricious or nefarious, but the fact that these types of technologies, number one, are out there. Number two, that if you will, the instructions to create such a thing might also be out there. For example, extant patents that might then be corruptible or used. Number three, that there may be not only nation states, but individual actors, either as proxies or independently, that might see this as an opportunity. I think also makes it very, very important, as others have said, that there's an increased awareness among the medical community of at least the viability of these types of things to pose from harm, if not risk. and what the actual threat risk might be, like anything else.
A couple of last questions, maybe to Doctors Lane and Lakritz. Thoughts about the role of A, neuropsychology, and B, neuropsychiatry and neuroimaging in study designs in this area moving forward? What would be scalable and deployable also?
I think we have some models for this type of team science approach in a number of disorders. And in fact, even thinking back to an earlier question about how to work with your physician, the first thought that came to my mind is that you need a team and that people are working together, but also addressing different aspects of an issue. So I see a clear role there, particularly given the role of, or the report of some of the cognitive difficulties, particularly related to attention, which we know can affect other cognitive areas, that would be a really nice piece to have of a more comprehensive study from that regard.
I completely agree with Dr. Lakritz there. And the only thing I would add is that the best science comes from a team that includes people who are working very closely with their patients, be they neuropsychologists, neuropsychiatrists, neurologists, what have you, is to have someone or someones on a team designing a project and following it through and thinking about what are the questions we need to ask, what are the skills we need to collect, what are the biomarkers we're interested in. And those processes are best informed when you have clinicians who are in the office, in the hospital, side by side with patients and hearing about their lived experiences. I find that those are the moments that really inform sound clinical research.
I want to thank Dr. DeCleva before I turn the mic back to him for organizing this, because I found it extremely interesting and valuable. We still have well over 100 people, and it's nearing the end of the day. So I think that's really impressive. So I'm going to turn it back to you, Dr. D.
Thank you, Dr. Cullum. A question that I have really for several of the other clinicians on the panel, Dr. Giordano, Dr. Lane, Dr. Lakritz, Dr. Cullum, and Dr. Staub, is we've all seen patients with severe symptom presentations of these neurological, neurovestibular, neuropsychiatric disorders who've been to many, many specialists, often in many different medical centers. We've had many patients, Dr. Staub, that say, I've been to Mayo, to your clinic and other clinics. They're really yearning and searching for answers, as Dr. Lane has said, to very difficult problems. But we've also seen patients who have moderate to severe symptoms that are crippling and disabling, and then suddenly, unexplainably get well. Do any of our other panelists want to comment on that? I find that amazing. I'm grateful for the patient when I see it. And sometimes they get well after a long period of time. So you can't attribute it to a medication. They've been on, let's say, an SSRI or SNRI for several years, and it didn't really work. And then suddenly they're better. They've had different types of therapies, vestibular, cognitive rehabilitation, and cognitive behavioral therapies. Nothing really worked for a long time. And then the patient got well. Is this spontaneous remission? Is it neuroplasticity? How do we explain this mystery that we often see?
Ken, that's a great question. I'm going to take just a very tentative stab at it. One of the things that I'm working with a wonderful group at the University of Pittsburgh is about beliefs and behaviors. And especially with respect to rehabilitation. And this work comes from back pain and rehabilitation there. And it gets at what patients, the convictions that they have about their illness and their outcomes. And things like, I can't do this if I'm still dizzy, or I can't do this if I can't think. And on a couple of occasions, I've seen people who, for whatever reason, they had to adopt a role that required them to think differently about their illness state, and they just were able to step up and do it. So a family demand, something like that. So I think that there's an area that we really have not studied well in medicine, psychiatry, psychology, neurology, about what human beings believe that they bring to their illness state and how that affects their outcomes. And I don't mean believe in a bad way. I'll give you an example. A very simple one of a patient who came and said, I can't go back to work until I'm not dizzy. And I said, well, why not? And they said, because the boss told me, don't come back until you're not dizzy. So I can't work until I'm not dizzy. That was a belief. That wasn't nefarious in any way. His boss told him that. And so basically it took a lot of work for us to get that person to even conceptualize doing things with partial symptoms because of the mindset that he brought. So I think beliefs, and again, not to cast aspersions on patients to use that, but human beliefs make a difference that we don't understand very well.
Well, let me add something to that if I could. This comes from somebody who I hold as very, very wise, certainly much smarter than me. One of my adult life mentors, Professor Edmund Pellegrino from Georgetown, a physician for 70 plus years at the bedside. And one of the stories that Ed used to like to tell sort of related to the person who's looking for their car keys. And they always say, well, I found them in the last place I looked. Yeah, exactly right. He said, very often that's the approach that we need to appreciate with clinical intervention. You need to try a variety of different things. What works, what doesn't, in whom and why. And very often it's the last thing that works, as the car key analogy. It's also, in some cases, a question of iterative effects that can occur that ultimately reach some, I hate to use the word tipping point, but sort of reset, if you will, the physiologic threshold to then prompt some kind of recovery, or at least recuperation and function that's accessible and therefore amenable to the patient. So part of that, I think the take-home message there is keep trying, and a variety of different approaches, because like so many other things, you don't keep looking in the same place for your keys. You look other places.
I think we'll end on that lovely note by Dr. Giordano. We started this conference on Havana syndrome, the first such conference held in an academic biomedical center in the United States that's open to all, by talking about patients. We spent most of the morning talking about clinical approaches to patients, real patients that we see here at UT Southwestern Medical Center under the rubric of the Peter O'Donnell Brain Institute. We then let Dan Hoffman and Mark Polymeropoulos and Ambassador Rubin kind of take us out of the clinic and look at the national security ramifications of Havana syndrome from the 30,000-foot level, at the level of the Pentagon, the CIA, the State Department, and really indirectly even the White House. And then I want to thank Dr. Staub and Dr. Giordano for kind of bridging that and bringing us back to end this discussion talking about patient care and the joys that patient care brings us, and that we look to a combination of curiosity and compassion, and as Dr. Giordano has said, ethics to help our patients. I want to thank all of you for attending. I want to give a special thank to all of our panelists and all of our guests. And for the guests, feel free to reach out to us. And these talks will be posted in the next couple of weeks on the UT Southwestern website. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Recording stopped.